Barakatah Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Ba'ashem Rachakodash. Welcome to another live lesson. The name of this one is The Decline of Babylon the Great. And this lesson pretty much was inspired. I was reading the book of Revelation 11 chapter. When I read the first two verses, it just put a thought in mind, of how the Lord, sets up prophecies and how when certain things are fulfilled, then everything moves to the next phase. So what I want to do is I want to read this real quick. Isaiah 42:9. Behold, the former things are come to pass, and new things do I declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them. And pretty much, that put into mind a certain time period that was given by the Lord, to where we were going to go through certain things, and after that certain thing happened, then there would be other things that followed it, and I'll explain it once we start getting into the chapter. And pretty much that is where we're at today in prophecy, because these things that were supposed to happen, the time periods that were supposed to take place, all took place. And now we're at the waning part of it, the ending part of it, because, everything has a beginning and it has an end. You have the beginning, the middle, and the end, as the Lord revealed to his prophets, So let's read Revelation 11, verses 1 and 2, and then we'll get into it, explain exactly what is meant by it. All right, Revelation 11 and 1. And there was given me a reed like unto a rod, and that reed like unto a rod is a measuring stick, and the rod is set for correction. The reed is a measuring stick, the rod is set for correction. So what does this reed and this rod consist of? The scriptures. It says, and an angel stood saying, rise and measure the temple of the Most High. So what is the temple of the Most High? When we read 1 Corinthians 3 and 16, it says that we are the temple of our bodies are the temple of the living power. So this temple of the Heavenly Father is a representation of the Israelites, which make up, all 12 tribes make up the temple of the Lord. So the angel was saying to take that reed, that measuring stick, and that rod, which is the Bible, right? And it says measure the temple of the Most High, because when you're measuring it, you're actually teaching it, to edify it, to build it, right? It says, and the altar. What does the altar represent? The altar represents where you worship at. So these people that are the temple of the Most High will be worshiping in this temple, right? And them that worship therein, which are all the Israelites. Then it goes on to say, but the court which is without the temple, leave out. Now, I don't know if it's going to say it in this one. Let's see, that's a number 1. That's verse 2. Cast out, right. So leave out meaning cast it out. So it says the court which is without the temple, leave out or cast it out, and measure it not, meaning don't teach it, because this is not a part of the actual temple of the Lord, which the temple of the Lord are the Israelites. For it is given unto the Gentiles. These are the actual nations. It says, but this is the point here, which pretty much is letting you know that the other nations have nothing to do with this. It's only the Israelites that have, anything to do with the scriptures, with the Bible, which is an actual contract that the Heavenly Father made with himself and with the nation of Israel, right? So the point is, when we read the next one, the next part of it is, and the holy city. Who's the holy city? The Israelites. Shall they tread underfoot 40 and 2 months. Now, when you add up the 40 and 2 months, It adds up to 3.5 years, but these 3.5 years are not just regular 3.5 years, they're prophetic years. So it would be 350 years. Now, how do we come up with that? Let's go to Revelation 13 and 1, and then we got a few other ones to go to, because there is a time period from when, you know, the southern kingdom was brought over to the side of the world in captivity until the beginning stages of the decline of America, Babylon the Great. And that's why it's so important to understand the history, understand these different time periods, because when you look at America prior to the 60s, to the 70s, America was thriving. They went through they went through hardship, during the 30s, but then the 20s was great for them. The 30s, they went through some hard times, but they were still on top. Then coming into the late 30s, into the 40s, they started prospering again. The 50s, into the 60s, but then around the 60s, there was a decline. And that's why it's so important to understand these things, because this is not something that happened by coincidence. These things that happen because it's prophesied. And that's what most people try to get away from, are the prophecies. So when we go to Revelation 13 and 1, which we're going to jump back and forth, it says, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea," which this is the Apostle John on the island of Patmos, "and saw a beast rise up out of the sea." This was an actual beast that he saw, but this beast is a representation of all of the empires of Esau, beginning with their origins in this time, meaning beginning with the Greeks. As we know their origins in this time, this is why they say civilization began with the Greeks, because that was the very beginning of Esau's empire, which was one of the heads of the 7 heads of this particular beast. That was the beginning of their empire. But their origins go all the way to a place called Mount Seir, Petra, the land of Edom, the Edomites. That's where their origins go back to. But from there, they spread out and eventually took over Europe, around the areas of Macedonia, Greece, and that's where they started to spread themselves over Europe and over the Mediterranean Sea, and pretty much over the world eventually. So it says, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The 7 heads is a representation of the 7 major empires, beginning with the Greeks, ending with the British. And the 10 horns is a representation of the European Union. Back then it was called the EEC, or the European Economic Community, which was established, which they got a charter. I believe they got a charter, or started a charter in March of 1957, but they weren't really established until January 1st, 1958. That's when the 10 horns really came into being. All right. And the 10 horns, which is a part of the actual beast, which the beast being NATO, they're part of the same beast, because they're all of those members of the European Union are all members of NATO also. Right. It says and upon his heads the names of blasphemy, because they call themselves the Heavenly Father, his Son. They call themselves Christians, which the actual Christians, so-called Christians, go back to the disciples of the Messiah. Those are the true, actual anointed ones. Not this bullshit that you hear out here today, this plantation Christianity. It says, "And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard." Now the leopard is the beginning of this beast. So the Lord is showing the Apostle John the origins of it, but he didn't really fully understand everything at that time, because it was really meant for this time for us to understand. So the leopard is a representation of Alexander the Creep, or Alexander the Greek, or they call him the Great, which was the first king that united all of those Greek regions and city states and became the first empire of Esau. It says, and his feet were as the feet of a bear. Now the bear is a representation of their end, which the end of them, or the bear, is a representation of Russia, because Russia is going to bring an end to this beast system that began with the Greeks, because Russia was never part of that system. Russia is not a part of the seven heads. Russia is going to be the one to bring them down. It says, in his mouth as the mouth of a lion. The mouth of a lion, a mouth is a representation of your power, where you speak, where the actual orders come from, and that's England. Because although America is the superpower, and although their currency is the world reserve currency, behind the scenes, you still have, the Rothschilds and them that are running things by certain individuals that are set up in England, that's still officiating the business, for America, right? So it says, and the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. Yeah, because that's the Roman Empire. Because the Roman Empire at this time that we're reading this prophecy, when it was written, the Roman Empire was in power. That was that great red dragon, which the great red dragon is a representation of all of them. But at this particular time, the Roman Empire was in power, and that's why when we read Revelation 17, it speaks about the five that were fallen, and the one that is was the Roman Empire, because they were in power at the time when this vision was being written. It said, and I saw one of his heads as it was wounded to death. Right. So that head that was wounded to death was the Roman Empire, because at that time, around the time when this was written, which is heavy, because at the time when this was written, that's when the last of the 12 emperors of Rome from the Flavian dynasty, Domitian, was taken down. And that's when Jake really started to rule, and govern over the Roman Empire. And eventually it became the Holy Roman Empire, from the pagan Roman Empire to the Holy Roman Empire. It says, and his deadly wound was healed. So now what this is doing is jumping back and forth in time, because it says that the deadly wound was healed. So the wound started around this time period, and eventually what happened was that even though Jake took over, they were still running things the way of the, pagan Roman Empire. But eventually, when you get further up in the history, eventually you had a separation, as you've heard Apostle Tara speaking about the Western Empire and the Eastern Empire, and there was a separation to where you had those that were pagan, and you had those that were quote unquote Christians, because they converted to Christianity around the year 325 AD or so, during the Nicene Council, or the Council of Nicaea, under Constantine's mother. I believe her name was Helen, if I'm not mistaken. I have to go back and research. I haven't been through that history in a long time. And she's the one that, suggested to him that, to convert, and that's a whole history on that. So, you will have to go and do the research on that, because there's a whole lot that comes with that, because really it wasn't really a Christian empire. It was a pagan empire, but it just had the guise of Christianity, so it was a whole, stuff that going on. So that from that point up until 1,000 years later, which we read in Revelation 20, that was the time period where they had a wound unto death, but then the deadly wound was healed. And this is why in the history you have something called the Renaissance, which is the rebirth. And that's when Esau came back into power, right? And his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast, because once that wound was healed and they came back into power, everyone on the planet started to come towards and bow down and worship and be in amazement of Esau, because they were the new power on the earth, because that deadly wound was healed. The Lord took away that dark cloud that was over them, And now it was their time to rule once again because they were loosed out of that prison sentence for a certain period of time. And that's why it's important to know that history. It says, and they worship the dragon which gave power unto the beast. Yeah, and that's why they're worshiping the ancient Roman Empire, and the things that are set up in this society, especially in America, are all set up under the ways, and customs of ancient Rome. All you have to do is look at the Senate buildings, look at the legislation, look at the construction of governmental buildings, their laws, where their laws go back to, if you become a lawyer, every law that's out there has a Latin phrase for it. You go to court, your different everything that you submit and things of that nature all have certain Latin terms for it. So it all goes back to that, So they worship the dragon which gave power unto the beast. It says, and they worship the beast, saying, who was like unto the beast? And the beast is who? NATO. Who was able to make war with him? And really, no one can make war with them. And that's why these nations, in order for them to defend themselves, they have to come together. Certain powers out there that are greater powers and lesser powers coming together in alliances in order to be able to defend themselves against the beast, which is NATO. America being a part of that, because America is a part of NATO. It says, and there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. And you see that, and now they claim to be Christians, right? But at the same time, they're going against the tenets and the commandments of the scriptures. They're saying that it's okay to be a homosexual, to be a lesbian. A woman has the right to have abortions if she wants. I mean, just a whole host of things. That's just to name a few, right? It says, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. And this is the point right here. 42 months is the same thing that we just read in Revelation, the 11th chapter. That 42 months, which when you break it down, it's 3.5 years, but it's 3.5 years of prophetic years, which are 350 years. Now let's go from there to Revelation 12 and 6. It says, and the woman, which is a representation of Israel, and this representation of Israel was really, when you read the whole chapter, was really the 3 tribes mainly that were left in the land of Israel, because there was a separation of the nation. 10 tribes that came to this side of the world, and 3 tribes, which was 2 tribes, and the Levites were there for the most part. You had a sprinkling of the other tribes there, but it was mainly Judah, Benjamin, and Levi, which was considered the southern kingdom. So this is who was actually here. So it says, and the woman fled into the wilderness. Why? Because there was a great persecution that was happening when the Romans came against Jerusalem, and they sacked Jerusalem. They besieged it, they sacked it, they destroyed the temple, so on and so forth. So the prophecy was that the Israelites were going to flee from there. Some fled up into Europe, some fled up into Asia, some fled up into different parts of the world, but a lot of Israelites fled down into the interiors of Africa. Why? Because those were the ones whose descendants later on will be brought over to so-called United States or America in captivity to fulfill prophecy. When you go back to Deuteronomy, the 28th chapter, where it says that our brothers would go into captivity by way of ships, and they will be sold. So it says, and the woman fled into the wilderness. So what is the wilderness? The wilderness is a representation of the interiors of so-called Africa, the land of Ham. And that's where, when you read the book, what's the name of that book? From Babylon to Timbuktu, I believe it is, by Rudolph R. Windsor. In one of the pages there, it tells you that from 65 BC, I believe it says 65 BC to the time when, around time of 70 AD, around there, It was estimated that more than 1 million Israelites had fled into Africa, because that was a common place where Jake would run back and forth to, because you had communities of Israelites that were living there, you know. So Jake would flee there for refuge. Joseph, Mary, and Yahushua fled down there, you know. The angel told him to go down there. Why? Because there were communities of Israelites in that region. So when the whole 70 AD happened, Jake, a lot of Jakes fled down into the interiors of Africa, not understanding that that was what the Lord wanted, because eventually he was going to set it up to where they were going to eventually be sold into captivity, into slavery by way of ships, to fulfill prophecy, to be brought over to this side of the world to fulfill prophecy. And it's all about prophecy, man. So it says, and the woman fled into the wilderness, interiors of Africa, the woman being Israel, the three tribes mainly, where she had the place prepared of the Most High. So what is that place that was prepared of the Most High? Over here in the Americas. Because over here in the Americas, this was the place where Jake was going to suffer the greatest punishment, you know, namely Judah, Benjamin, and Levi, you know. But the ones that came on the shores, you know, which was, you had a lot of Judites that came on the shore, you know, and that was the main, because that Judah is the head tribe. That's why they received the most hell. You see, it says that they should feed her there in 1,203 score days, which when you break that down, 1,203 score days, the 40 and 2 months, it all adds up to 3.5 years, which is the 3.5 years prophetic, which is 350 years. Because from the time that Jake was brought over here, they were brought over here before, but the bulk were brought here around 1620. All right. There was something that took place after that 350 year period that started to really set up the downfall of this place. See, everything, time and chance, the scriptures say time and chance happeneth to all men. And there were things that were happening, Salakia. There were things that were happening that were setting this whole thing up in motion. You know, and people are always trying to get away from prophecy, but you can't get away from prophecy. Prophecy is where it's at, Salakia. Prophecy is where it's at. And when you understand that history, you understand, you know, this didn't happen to anybody else. This didn't happen to any other nation. People that are calling themselves Israelites that are in that land now, these Amalekites, this didn't happen to them. You know, and this is how we know, like the scriptures say, the scriptures bear witness with our spirit that we are the sons of the living power. You see? So that 1,203 score days, or the 40 and 2 months, or the 3.5 years, that is a representation of 350 years. Because when you understand the history, what happened to the Israelites back then, they were sacked by the Romans in 70 AD. Excuse me. The temple was destroyed, and a lot of Israelites fled into the so-called interiors of Africa, right? Or to the interiors of so-called Africa. From there, about a good, 1,500 years later or so, they started to be sold and brought over to this side of the world, which they call the transatlantic slave trade. And from the time they got here, 1620, until the time of that 350 year period, what happened? There was a liberation, not of the people physically, because there was never a liberation. There was just a transfer of power, that so-called Emancipation Proclamation. But what happened, what took place, is that there was a liberation mentally of the Israelites that were here. And their mind started to wake up to what was going on. And in the midst of all of that, there were other things that were happening, taking place, you know, and building up, you know, to what we see today. And that's why you see so many Israelites waking up all around the world, because prophecies have been happening, prophecies happen, and prophecies are happening. Right? Now, let's go from there to back to Revelation 11 and 3, because once the bulk of the slaves are brought here, 1620, if you take 1620, right, let's use a calculator right now. Let's take 1620 plus 350. What does that equal? 1970. So around 1969, 1970, and you have to remember, Abba Bivens, Elder Abba Bivens didn't come on the scene in 1969, 1970. Elder Abba Bivens had been around for a long time. He was a part of the commandment keepers. But eventually he broke away from them because the Spirit of the Lord moved him to get into the New Testament, which a lot of those Old Testament heads weren't into, because they were following the ways of Amalek. And Amalek does not accept the New Testament because they don't accept the Messiah, because they know that the Messiah is a so-called black man. And that's why they don't accept the New Testament. See, because they're waiting for their own so-called Messiah, which they're not going to have a Messiah. You see? So that's why them Old Testament heads were off. Now, when you say, well, y'all, when y'all started off under the, yeah, because there had to be a beginning to it, But then the Spirit slowly but surely molded the men of the Lord to break away from a lot of the customs and things that they were doing, and started to really get into the scriptures and get a broader understanding of what we're dealing with today, But there had to be certain stepping stones, certain origins and beginnings, before the Lord can mold and shape the minds of the men to a more proper way. You see, we had to start somewhere. All right, so let's go. And then once the 350 years was up, the Spirit had Elder Abba Bivens teaching, gathering other men to him. There were other turmoils and things that were going on in the world, especially here in America. There was a lot of problems, a lot of divisions, a lot of revolutions, a lot of degeneracy going on. The so-called free love, homosexual love, and promiscuity was out there, drug use, and just a whole lot of stuff that was bringing this devil down, because there was a particular point that they had to reach in order for them, to start to wane. They had to reach their pinnacle first before they started waning. So when we read Revelation 11:3, it says, "And I will give power unto my 2 witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth." Now, what does that mean? Well, the 350 days, or the 1,260 days, that is a representation of slavery. Because once Judah, Benjamin, and Levi came over to the side of the world, that began the next phase. So how did they prophesy? Because they couldn't, in some cases they couldn't talk. In other cases, if they wanted to laugh, they had to put their head in the barrel. They were under total subjection under Esau. So how were they prophesying? Were they out there in the streets cursing Esau? "You damn devil, we're gonna get you, man. You got us now, but we're gonna get you back." No. The prophesying part for the 350 years represents what they were going through. The slavery, the separation of the families, the being sold on auctioning blocks, the being called niggas, spooks, whatever the case was that Esau was calling them. The men being buck broken, the women being raped, the vexations and all of that was going on. That's how they were prophesying for those 350 years, meaning the prophecies were on them. And the things that they went through was bearing witness that these were the people that were brought here to suffer these things, because prophecies had to keep moving forward. Now, let's go from there. Let's go to the book of Isaiah, the 28th chapter. So the prophecies were on them. Isaiah 28, and we're going to read a couple of verses, then jump around. Let me see, 12 and 13. It says, to whom he said, this is the rest wherewith you may cause the weary to rest. Who are the weary? The Israelites. What is the rest? The Bible, the Comforter. So this is the rest. This book is the rest where you rest. You come to and you see the things that are pleasing to the Lord, and you try to do the best that you can in order to please the Lord Yahweh Shem Shai, so he can have mercy, right? It says, and this is the refreshing, yet they would not hear. They didn't want to accept it. So what happened? It says, but the word of the Lord was unto them precept upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little and there a little. Now this is the way we break the scriptures down, but this is also what took place upon our people. You know, the going into captivity, you know, the sorrow of mind, the bywords, the separation of families, our women becoming harlots. Those are precepts that came upon Jake, precept upon precept, line upon line. Just the same way we break the scriptures down, here a little and there a little. So a scripture in Isaiah, you know, certain things that were said in Isaiah came upon Jake. Certain things that were said in Deuteronomy came upon Jake in different books. So that's how Jake was prophesying here. Because once Judah, Benjamin, and Levi were brought to the side of the world, that began the end for this devil, because eventually what would happen is that the tribes are going to come back together as one. But all of these things had to be fulfilled first. So that's why we're at in prophecy where we're at right now. So it goes on to say, but the word of the Lord was unto them precept upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little and there a little, that they might go and fall backward and be broken and snared and taken. See? Why? By these prophecies, by these words, by the lines and the precepts here and there that were coming upon Jake. So for that 350 years, Jake, look at the clothing that they had. Ripped up clothes, you know, the sackcloth for 350 years. Until the Lord caused it to go into the next phase. All right? Now, we're going to go into the next phase, because after Jake went through all of that, then there was a change, because you got to remember, you had some Jakes that were well-to-do. There was a lot of communities in America where Judah was doing great. They were prospering. You have something called cities underwater, where these devils destroyed Jake's communities so much that they built lakes over their communities. You know, this one woman was bringing it out. You know, that you had underwater cities, because it wasn't just Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Rosewood. You know, there were many cities where Jake was doing good. They were prospering, you know. But these devils didn't want that. And plus, the Lord, you know, didn't want that, because Jake was brought here to suffer captivity, suffer slavery. That's why it says that you will not be able to prosper in all that you put your hands forth to do. You will have to come to this man for everything. So now, let's jump to the 18th verse. It says, and your covenant with death shall be disannulled, and your agreement with hell shall not stand. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, then you shall be trodden down by it. Yeah, because the Lord decreed it already. Who gave Jacob to the spoiler, and to the robbers? Did not the Most High? So that's how the word took Jake on, and that's how Jake prophesied, by the words of the Lord being upon them. You know, then eventually later on the prophets came on and started speaking, teaching the words. It says, from the time that it goeth forth, it shall take you. See? For morning by morning shall it pass over, by day and by night, and it shall be a vexation only to understand the report. And that's why Jake was going through so many hard times, hardships, because of the prophecies. Now let's go from there to Obadiah, because everything had a beginning and everything had an end. And when they ended their prophesying, it was time to go to the next phase. You know, just bear with me 1 second. It was time to go to the next phase. Salakia. All right, so now let's go to Obadiah. It's 1 chapter long. We're going to read the first 4 verses. It says, the vision of Obadiah, thus saith the Lord, power, concerning Edom. We have heard a rumor from the Lord, and an ambassador sent among the heathen. Arise ye, and let us rise up against her in battle. Behold, I have made thee small among the heathen. Thou art greatly despised, because the Edomites are greatly despised. You know, and you see that, you know, when you look at the actions and the things that these devils have done. It says, the pride of thy heart has deceived thee, and they're very proud. Thou that dwellest in the clefts of the rock, which is what? The caves, you know. And these devils are the ones that are known for their caveman status. Whose habitation is high. When you look at their habitation, what is your habitation? Where you live. Esau likes to build these high rise, these what they call skyscrapers, you know, and they're all over the world. Why? Because they started here in America, and the other nations started following suit behind the devil, you know, committing fornication with their harlot. It says, whose habitation is high, that saith in his heart, who shall bring me down to the ground? Because they never believe that they're going to be taken down. They pretty much bought their own, drank their own Kool-Aid. You know, like the prophecy said, who can make war with the beast, you know? So they really believe that they're never going to go down. So this is what the Lord said. It says, though thou exalt thyself as the eagle, which is a clue as to who we're dealing with. Because Esau's symbol is the eagle. Now, when you go back to the inception of this country, you had an individual by the name of Benjamin Franklin that wanted the turkey to be the bird of symbol for America. But they said, nah, they wanted the eagle. And that's not by coincidence. That's the Lord making them pick, you know, the eagle, because the eagle represents the most proudest bird, the most high flying bird. And that's how Esau is. You know, they're just like the eagle. They had the same characteristics of an eagle. There was even a president that had an eagle rug on his head. Now, that's just a joke. And that's why that eagle tried to bite Trump, because he had his cousin on his head. It says, though thou exalt thyself as the eagle, that's his symbol. Look on the dollar bill. Look on the quarters. Look on, you know, in these different buildings. The U.S. Post Office. You know, it says, and though thou set thy nest among the stars. Now, when did they set their nest among the stars? Because you have something called a space race, right? And in 1969, so-called Apollo space shuttle, so-called reached the moon. Which they never reached the moon, but they did set their nests up in the stars, because you have satellites and space stations and all that out there. But they never went to the moon, even though they told people they did. But ever since that time period, 1969, they started to come down. It says, and though thou set thy nest amongst the stars, thence will I bring thee down, save the Lord Yahweh B'Shem El-Shai. So it's no coincidence that at the same time this was fulfilled, right? And they did this, that they started coming down. And this was the same time period where the 350 years of Jake being in captivity happened, because it was around 1619, 1620, and 350 years later is around 1969, 1970. And that's when Esau really started to come down and fall down. I had this article that I found earlier. You know, I forgot what I typed in, but the name of it is called A Brief History of the Drug War. And see, this is what happened. Like the demoralization, the social breakdown, you know, the economic breakdown, just in general, the family structure, everything in this place started really going downhill from that point on. You had the hippie movement, you had revolutionary groups, you had the soldiers coming back from Vietnam, you had the opioid problem, which was a lot of people were hooked on drugs. The free love, promiscuity, just the devaluing of family values, everything started dwindling, started falling at that time. And that's exactly what the Lord said. So it's no coincidence that they went up to the so-called moon in 1969. The 350-year period of Jake being in captivity, was ending around that same time, and the falling of America started happening back then. There's no coincidence to that. So it says a brief history of the drug war, and I was supposed to post this in the description box, but I forgot. I had copied it, but I forgot. So if you want, you could just type in. This is from drugpolicy.org. You could type in a brief history of the drug war, and this will come up. Now, I'm not going to read any of this early drug stages. It goes into that. I'm just going to jump down to the part where it says Nixon and the generation gap. Listen good. In the 1960s, right? No coincidence that the 350-year period was up around this time. In the 1960s, as drugs became symbols of youthful rebellion, social upheaval, and political dissent, the government halted scientific research to evaluate their medical safety and efficacy. In June 1971, President Nixon declared a war on drugs. He dramatically increased the size and presence of federal drug control agencies and pushed through measures such as mandatory sentencing and no-knock warrants. A top Nixon aide, John Ehrlichman, later admitted, "You want to know what this was really all about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Nixon temporarily placed marijuana in Schedule 1, the most restrictive category of drugs, pending review by a commission he appointed, led by Republican Pennsylvania Governor Raymond Schaefer. In 1972, the commission unanimously recommended decriminalizing the possessions and distribution of marijuana for personal use. Nixon ignored the report and rejected its recommendations. Between 1973 and 1977, however, 11 states decriminalized. So it's going into the history of, the so-called war on drugs. Then it says the 80s and 90s, drug hysteria and skyrocketing incarceration rates, because this country really started to decline at this point, because it was prophecy that was being fulfilled, and that's what we read in Obadiah, that when you set your nest among the stars, thence will I bring you down. And it's no coincidence that that's around the same time when the 350-year period of Jake's slavery was up. And it's no coincidence that Elder Abba Bivens and the men that were with him were teaching his word, and this word started taking root. That's why I said, and I will give power unto my two witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,203 days, clothed in sackcloth. And that's exactly what took place. So when Judah, Benjamin, and Levi got here, that's when the coming together of all the tribes began to happen, and that began what we see today, and let's see, let's go real quick to the book of Ezekiel 37. Ezekiel 37. Let me see, what time is it? It's, yeah, get ready to close up in a few. Ezekiel 37 and 5. I'm going to read a few verses here. It says, thus saith the Lord power unto these bones. Behold, I will cause breath to enter into you, and you shall live. And this is what was happening during this time period. Jake started waking up, but they didn't have the proper breath, but they started coming together. There's no coincidence that all these things happened around the same time period. The revolutionary movements of the 60s and 70s, you know, so-called black revolutionary groups, so-called Latino revolutionary groups coming together, and they were mingling with each other also, because you had Judite members among the so-called Latino groups, you had Latino members among the so-called Negro groups. There was no coincidence in that. It says, and I will lay sinews upon you, and will bring up flesh upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am the Lord. So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I prophesied, there was a noise, and behold, a shaking. And that shaking was what? All these things that were happening that caused Jake to come together for all the social woes and, you know, injustices that were being committed against him. It says, and the bones came together, bone to his bone. And when I beheld, lo, the sinews and the flesh came up upon them, and the skin covered them above, but there was no breath in them. Yeah, because they didn't have the truth back then. There, you know, the thought and idea of coming together for the protection of the so-called quote unquote community was a benevolent thing, because that's the only thing Jake knew. But they weren't doing it with the proper breath, because they didn't have the truth. But the truth was out there. So there's no coincidence that all of these different things were happening, and they went to the moon. They started to decline. The drug problems, the hippies and this and the revolutionary movements, and there's no coincidence. And the men of the Lord were there teaching the word. It's no coincidence. It's all prophecy. Believe it or not. Inside joke. Then said he unto me, prophesy unto the wind, prophesy, son of man, and say to the wind, thus saith the Lord power, come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live. Why? Because it says that the man that wandereth out of the way of understanding shall remain in the congregation of the dead. So they had to be resuscitated, resurrected. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath came into them, and they lived. See, how did they live? With the breath coming into them, in the same time period, the truth coming out and bringing them back to their tribe, bringing them back to their true essence of life, and stood up upon their feet, an exceeding great army. And you're seeing this happening right now. And this is why Esau is scared. Because the Lord said, I'm going to, you thought I was all together just like you. You did all this shit. You thought I was with you. He said, I'm going to set them in order before your face. And that's what we see right now. We see the Israelites being set up in order before the face of the wicked, which are the Edomites. It says, then he said unto me, son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, our bones are dried and our hope is lost. We are cut off for our parts. And one more verse. Therefore prophesy and say unto them, thus saith the Lord power, behold, O my people, I will open your graves and cause you to come up out of your graves and bring you into the land of Israel, because these other nations weren't doing that. They saw Jake in the messed up condition that they were in, and they left him there. Salaki, brothers. All right, so now let's go from there back to Revelation 11 and 4. This is Revelation 11 and 4. It says, these are the two olive trees and the two candlesticks standing before the power of the earth. See, because they're coming together now as one. The two kingdoms, Judah and Ephraim, or Judah or Judah, or the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. All right. It says, and if any man will hurt them, fire proceedeth out of their mouth and devoureth their enemies. And if any man will hurt them, he must be in this manner killed. These have power to shut the heaven, that it rain not in the days of their prophecy, and have power over waters to turn them to blood, and to smite the earth with plagues as often as they will. And that happened back during the time of Elijah. That happened back during the time of Moses. You know, you had all these things happening. And the elect will not be hurt. You know, no one is going to be able to hurt the elect because they are the elect. Like the Lord told the angels, don't hurt the earth until we seal the servants of our power in their forehead. It says, and when they shall have finished their testimony, meaning what? When the time is up and they finished everything, now it's time to go to the next phase. It says, the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them and shall overcome them and kill them. Yeah, because we are fast approaching the time of Jacob's trouble. But from that time, when the 350 years was up, this devil started falling. The truth started being brought out there. They've been looking for ways in how to destroy Jake. So we're now at the point now where Jacob's trouble is about to take place, which is one of the last things besides the mark of the beast and World War III to really happen before the Lord comes back. So we're at the point of Jacob's trouble about to really explode, you know, out here. You know, and you see that there's shortages everywhere. I played a little clip from a video that this guy said that these different corporations are purposely making the trucks leave these different supplies in these different warehouses on purpose, because they're about to do some shit. It says, and kill them. It says, and their dead bodies shall lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom in Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. And that's where you see Jake in the dead state that they were in here in America, because they had no breath in them until the Lord breathed upon them. You see? And these nations didn't help, but they did help. They helped, like the scriptures say, they helped forward the affliction. It says, and they of the people and kindreds and tongues and nations, which are the other nations, shall see their dead bodies 3 days and a half, the whole time period when Jake was in captivity, all the way up until 1969, 1970, and shall not suffer the dead bodies to be put in graves. Yeah, because they weren't helping. They weren't telling Jake, look, you're the Israelites. And they knew, the higher-ups of them knew. So why didn't they say anything? Because prophecy had to be fulfilled. And they that dwell upon the earth shall rejoice over them and make merry, and shall send gifts one to another, because these two prophets tormented them that dwell on the earth. Yeah, so they were happy that we were brought down. Read Lamentations, the 2nd chapter. How the nations were happy as a pig in shit that the Lord brought us down. You see? It says, and after 3 days and a half, which is that 350-year period, it says, the spirit of life from the Most High entered into them. So it's no coincidence that around 1969, 1970, this started happening, along with all of those other things that were happening. Because what we're teaching right now came from that period in Harlem, under a man by the name of Elder Albert Bivens. And he chose, because he had other students. And on his deathbed, he called, you know, King Masha and High Priest Ariah, and you had High Priest Jacob that was there, that was a part of that. And those were the 3 men that were set up to continue this word. It's no coincidence. And after 3 days and a half, not before, not in the middle, not during, it said, and after 3 days and a half, the 350-year period, from around 1619, 1620 to around 1969, 1970. The spirit of life entered into them, and they stood upon their feet, and great fear fell on them which saw them. So this is where we're at in prophecy. All right, now let's go from there. Revelation 13. Well, I jumped the gun. I shouldn't have read the 11th verse yet, but that's all right. We can read it again. Revelation 13, 6 to 8. It says, and the woman fled into the, that's 12. 13, 6 to 8. It says, and he opened his mouth in blasphemy against the Most High. That's dealing with the beast, Esau's power structure, to blaspheme his name and and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven, which they do. It says, and it was given unto him to make war with the saints, and this is where we're coming into, and to overcome them, and power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations, and that's what they have. They have that power right now. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of the of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. That's right. So this is the point we're in. The point we're in is a point of deception, but there's also a separation of the elect being established. Right. So now I should have read Revelation 11:11, which it's coming into that now. Revelation 11:11. And after 3 days and a half, the spirit of life entered into them, and they stood upon their feet, and great fear fell upon them which saw them. Now let's go from there to Revelation 13:9 and 10. And this is why Esau's nervous, because when they stood up on their feet, they got nervous. Why? Because sentences were being brought against them. Judgments were being brought against them verbally until the Lord comes back and does it physically. So Revelation 13:9 says, if any man have an ear, let him hear. He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints. And this is what we're telling these devils, and they don't want to hear it, because they want to continue living their life the way they've been living it, and they don't want to be held accountable for their actions. But you're going to be held accountable for your actions, because this is what you've done. And you did it to the children of the Most High, to the people of the Most High. And the Most High, Yahweh Bashem El Shai, is going to deal with you. He's going to deal with you, Esau. He's going to tear you limb from limb. You rat bastard. So with that, I pray that your brothers have been edified. I meant to put this in the description box, but I forgot. Just type in drugpolicy.org and type in a brief history of the drug war. And you should be able to get this article so you can read more about it in the war on drugs. And it's no coincidence that all these things happened around the 60s and 70s. It's all part of the prophecy, man. So with that, I pray that your brothers have been edified and your few sisters. Till the next time I say shalom.